Japan is about to trigger something very unpredictable. I mean, it could go okay. I mean, the sudden some other economic factor could occur, and the sudden reduction in price in LNG might cause something else to happen. And the problem isn't that LNG price collapse is definitely going to happen. The problem is that uncertainty is definitely going to happen, and markets, global markets, investments respond to uncertainty, and that uncertainty is definitely coming. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk today about some of the global impacts of Japanese energy policy.
Great, that's wonderful. So I think Bruce and Torrance, you might have already, quote unquote, met David Sharp on LinkedIn because he's also there. So David is a marine engineering officer, and he has been traveling between Japan and throughout the world on cruise lines and other boats, I believe. So he has also been going through his engineering studies during the past couple of years, I believe. And we are pleased to have you here today, David. So it looks like you have prepared quite a few things for us. I'm not sure that we'll be able to cover all of them. So please do not worry about that. If we cannot cover all, then we can continue another time. So no worries about that. So please go ahead and let's see what we can learn from you today.
Thanks very much, Maya. So I'll also be touching on some points coming out of the recent Hiroshima G7 meeting, specifically those outlined in Sapporo in April when we had the G7 preparatory climate, energy and environment ministerial meeting. And during the talk, I'm going to go through a number of specific technical examples, as well as moving between some economic analysis and geopolitical analysis. So if you want me to stop at any time, just speak up maybe if I say something that's a little unclear, or I use an acronym or some term that is a bit of industry jargon and that needs to be explained. So before we go any further, I have to give a disclaimer. I had some training about this at my last job. I have to let you know that for legal purposes, all the information and analysis I'm presenting today doesn't represent the views of any of my employers, past, present, or future, and this is all my own personal work. So Maya, thank you for the self-introduction there. It's a real privilege to be on your Japan Expert Insights. I've been following various forms of Japan professional networking on LinkedIn for many years now, and this one really stands out as such a great forum. I'm approaching 40 now. I've had 3 professions. I'm not sure if I'm an expert in any of them, but you guys can decide. I've had 3 professions so far. My first one, I had a leadership bursary to study at the University of St Andrews. So I was part of the British Army for about 5 or 6 years before working at the Military Academy of Sandhurst. In 2007, I moved to Japan and I worked as a teacher and then an intercultural manager, eventually at the conglomerate Nichigakkan as a seishain or permanent employee. And I got my master's in international business management at the time. Then since 2016, I became a merchant sailor, specifically marine engineering officer, and I got my license and my degree in marine engineering and naval architecture. As you said, I work in cruise ships mostly now, but I've done container ships in the past. And I did look at LNG cargo ships and chose not to go into them for reasons we'll get into later in the presentation. My specific roles on board the ships have been as varied as exhaust gas emissions engineer to water plant manager, firefighting team leader to watchkeeping. So I've done a bit of everything on the ship, really. My engineering degree focused on feasibility of upgrading existing ships to run on LNG, as well as running on marine diesel and heavy fuel oil. And when I was in Japan, I worked and lived in Ibaraki. I still live there now, specifically in the area of Tokai Mura. I don't know if any of you have heard of Tokai. It's famous, but not for a good reason. There was a nuclear incident there in 1999, which you can look up on Wikipedia and find out all about it. So I had lots of friends in Tokai who worked for JEA or Todai or the fusion research plants there, and that's how I first got my interest in engineering, specifically nuclear engineering. And unfortunately, I was living there at the time of the Tohoku earthquake disaster in March 2011. I was on the 3rd floor of a junior high school when it happened, and Tokai Mura, just for information, is about 90 kilometers south of the Fukushima reactor incident. I mention this because with so many friends and neighbors in the nuclear world, I was highly aware of the important role that LNG played in making up the energy deficit after the temporary denuclearization of Japan's energy grid after 2011. So in terms of the technical stuff, I'll jump into it. It might not be everybody's cup of tea, but it kind of plays a role in the economic analysis later about Japan's role in energy markets. But as part of my dissertation, I looked at the cost of carrying out an upgrade on a single ship to be LNG compatible. And I looked at also the global infrastructure around LNG. So it's liquid natural gas, for those who don't know. And obviously, having lived in Japan and lived through Fukushima quite nearby, I was aware that the price of LNG, the high price of LNG, that was driving a lot of this change over to this new fuel supply in the maritime industry was potentially a temporary thing due to Japan's loss of nuclear power. And not many people in the maritime industry or the LNG industry kind of looked at that in detail. So the cost of upgrading a single engine to LNG compatible is about €950,000. So we can call that roughly €1 million. And most cargo ships or large container ships will have 4 such engines on board. And then you've got the cost of surveys, engineering, naval architecture, project management, fuel system upgrades, automation and control. So it works out around 15 to 20 million euros per ship to upgrade it to this LNG standard, which is a lot of money considering. Now, what was driving this LNG refitting at the time was global standards for environmental emissions. So we can see really that historically, the things that you would control on a ship to make it economic and productive would be the cost of the fuel, and it would be the cost of crewing the ship. Now, in terms of crewing, we can take crew from Indonesia or from the Philippines or from any part of the world, and we can find the crew that have the right mix of skills for the right cost. And then for the fuel, we have this heavy fuel oil, which is very bad for the environment, but we can treat it in certain ways. It needs to run at like 110 degrees, and it needs to be processed on board. It's quite complicated and quite messy, but it makes it economically viable to run ships, which powers the entire global economy in terms of cargo, not just my particular sector of cruises and for holidaymakers and that. But in order to refit a single ship for LNG use, it's going to be 15 to 20 million euros. And then also I had a look at the global supply chains as well, because it's not just a simple case of changing an engine or adding components and parts so that an engine will now run on a new type of fuel. You have to have a global infrastructure of depots and cargo ships and tankers and pipelines and storage tanks onshore as well as on the ships. And the particular challenge with LNG is that it needs to be kept at around 100 to minus 162 degrees, so it's minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit, I think, in order for it to be a liquid for transport and storage purposes. So the maritime industry in the 20-teens went ahead and invested in this. Let's see, I got my analysis here. So the particular investments was two big investments in LNG that affected maritime were both in Russia. We had the joint Japanese-Russian Sakhalin-2 project just up north of the Sakhalin Island, which was the Mitsui Corporation, Mitsubishi Corporation, Royal Dutch Shell, as well as Gazprom, which is a kind of Russian government-affiliated entity. And then we had the Yamal project, which was a brand new gas project, LNG project, just at the very north of Russia, up in the Arctic. And it's kind of geopolitically challenging, that one, because it's partially funded by the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which doesn't make it very friendly to Japan or Western powers. But we'll get on to Belt and Road another day. But basically, the entire maritime industry spent estimated $850 billion upgrading its ships so that they could take this LNG fuel, upgrading the infrastructure so that we could have, no matter where you were in the world, if your cargo ship was bringing your Amazon delivery from a factory in China to a suburb in Buenos Aires, you would be able to take it on these much more environmentally friendly and fuel-efficient ships. So this global infrastructure was created, and now we're in a situation unrelated to the current Russian war in Ukraine, where Japan previously had already stated this goal of denuclearization after Fukushima, then renuclearization to a certain extent by 2030. Now, when you renuclearize the energy grid in Japan, then you're going to be cutting the amount of LNG that you're importing, and that's kind of the main point of the topic today. Japan is potentially about to extremely rapidly destabilize the global supply chain by destabilizing the price of LNG. So yeah, we can take a quick look. I've got some diagrams here. If anyone wants to email me later, I can send you my notes and my diagrams. I'm sorry we don't have any visuals, but the Japan energy mix in 2013 was 43% LNG, and the goal, as stated by METI and the Japanese government, is to reduce LNG by about half, down to 27%, not quite half, down to 27%. And replacing this missing 20% of LNG, we're going to be having 22% nuclear and much more renewables, including hydropower. So that's the plan, as stated, go from 43.2% LNG down to 27% by 2030. And it's now 2023, and we're nowhere near close. The current figures I could find for this is that the Japan energy mix, renewable energy has been improving a lot. That's something to be proud of. But we're still running in Japan on LNG at 37.7%. So there's another 10% to go. And whether or not we'll make that in the next 7 years is the question. Whether or not shifting that much LNG demand out of the market and not replacing it is what that's going to do to Russia, what it's going to do to the price of LNG, which will impact maritime industry and other countries' internal markets is the big question I'm kind of contemplating with this presentation today. Okay, where am I? I've just gone off my notes. Okay, so in 2018, it was unclear which technology would be the best way forward for a lot of companies. So about 65% of the maritime market went for LNG. Other companies, they decided to do other things. They went to diesel-only ships. In the maritime world, diesel is considered one of the cleanest fuels. It doesn't really have a lot of impurities. So in order to meet the 2020 sulfur emissions targets, a lot of ships just went down to pure diesel. I know that's strange to hear from a car driving point of view, but it's very clean from our point of view. Other companies invested in developing a new form of heavy fuel oil that is basically sulfurless or very, very low sulfur, ultra low sulfur fuel oil. And that's been a very popular approach because it doesn't require minus 162 degree storage facilities and all sorts of special technology. I mean, the technology between the LNG stuff, I mean, from an engineer's point of view, it's very interesting technology because we have, on every ship, we have to have tanks that are cryogenically down to these really low temperatures. And then the fuel lines from the tanks need to be really secure. You can't have the fuel coming from the tank being warmed up and then maybe leaking out. You'll have a massive explosion. So they developed this really clever kind of dual piping system. So the inner narrow pipe will carry the LNG gas fuel, and then there'll be an outer pipe, and then the environment in the engine room, and the space in between will be kept at a negative pressure or very, very low pressure, below air pressure. So that if there is a crack, then that LNG gas isn't going to escape out into the engine room. It's going to stay in the cavity where it'll get driven by fans away, and that makes it very safe. So technically, LNG has been a real interesting development. But unfortunately, with the Japanese commitment to 2030 getting rid of half of its current LNG usage, we're going to see a massive drop in the global demand for LNG. At the same time, the European Union, through the International Energy Agency, has also released a 10-point plan for not the reduction of LNG alone, but specifically the reduction of LNG supplied from Russia, which again has very strong geopolitical implications. So we could see a collapse in the price of LNG globally. Now, it might seem like a good thing to have a collapse in the price of LNG. We can buy more fuel, we can use more fuel. Isn't that wonderful? But the problem is that if you have a sudden collapse in price, even over a period of years, then there's a reduction in demand. Reduction in demand means there's an oversupply. If the collapse in price is so much, and it might be, that the producers in Russia and Australia and Iran and Norway, if they can't turn a profit anymore, then we're going to basically have overnight a lot of energy companies backed by a lot of governments suddenly going bankrupt, suddenly unable to pay monthly loan payments for capital investment. So it's really important that we make sure that any reduction in demand is met with a similar reduction in supply. And that's why, really, ideally, Japan geopolitically would be, and I would hope should be, finding a way to talk with Russia so that we can manage the decline of this industry properly. It's going to be very difficult, obviously, with the Russian situation in Ukraine, but there are good signs. I mean, the Russians are fighting with the West and Japan's Western aligned at the moment. However, the Japanese are still working cooperatively with the Russians on the project I mentioned before, the Sakhalin-2 LNG project. So Mitsui and Mitsubishi haven't pulled out of that, whereas Royal Dutch Shell have pulled out of that project. So the Japanese are walking a very fine line in terms of trying to reduce their dependence on Russian imports of LNG, but in a manageable and safe way. Because if you suddenly reduce it, then there'll be a lot of unemployed and angry and bankrupt Russians blaming Japan for that, which wouldn't be good for anybody, I don't think. Okay, so I know, having lived in Japan, that Japanese people see Japan as a small country. And having spoken to a lot of Americans, Americans normally are not too surprised when a third country or someone from another part of the world takes an interest in American politics and American economics, because it affects everybody. Japan often sees itself as a small country, but actually now that it's got this control over this LNG price, it's got the leverage of a really big country. I mean, Japan has its finger on this energy market, and if it pushes the scale anyway, then it could collapse the international maritime logistic system. It could do a lot of things to Russia in terms of manipulating the prices here, which is not something that countries normally like Japan get to do. I mean, in the last 4 years, Japan's been getting more and more LNG from Australia, and this speaks to the growing bond between Japan and Australia, which is no doubt part of the geopolitical emphasis on the Quad in the last 5 or so years since it was resurrected. But the G7 declaration recently, there was a big deal made at G7 about the Russian use of energy supply as a method of war. And Japan's now faced with a situation where they're going to cut their LNG supply, probably from Russia. And how are the Russians going to take that? I mean, we're as the G7 countries, we're telling Russia, you can't manipulate prices, you can't cut demand. You've got to think of how it impacts the economies of other countries. But Japan is still going right ahead with its plans to cut LNG by half its current consumption by 2030, only 7 years away. So it might be a potential strategy coming out of this, that Japan could talk to Australia or some of its friendlier countries and explain that, in pure economic terms, it might be best for Japan to cut its dependence on Russian LNG. But in terms of the blowback or the impact or the problems that might cause with Russia, it might be wiser instead to cut LNG from Australia, from other parts, from Norway, from other parts of the world, and maintain some form of LNG trade relationship with the Russians. Otherwise, there's a real potential with the Europeans cutting off LNG supply from Russia and the Japanese doing it both by 2030. There's a real chance that we could leave the Russians in a kind of we have nothing to lose mindset, and the threat of conflict gets ever closer the more desperate and the more isolated the Russians become. So moving away from engineering now, as some of you will be delighted to hear, and moving more towards politics. So it's often said nowadays that we're in this new world of great power politics with the rise of Russia and the rise of China. Much of the post-World War II political logic was based upon the assumption that increasing trade ties and globalization of suppliers and markets would reduce the chances of conflict and war. Certainly the rise of China and the development of a more open market system was expected to lead to also democratization and social liberalization of China. This, we now know, isn't what happened. The Chinese and the Russians are re-emerging as regional powers with ambition. And we've entered a period of history that, to my reading, is quite similar to pre-World War One 20th century. It's not an exact parallel in history, nothing is, but we can look at how things went in the past and learn from them. Before World War One, peace was guaranteed, many thought, by a complex series of mutually beneficial pacts and treaties and alliances and mutually beneficial arrangements, and we've arrived back at the same place. We've spent decades now building strong energy and trade ties between Japan and Russia and the US and this country and that. And we thought it was going to keep us safe, but turns out certain countries and certain actors don't see it that way. And Japan and the Western allies have pursued these policies of mutual benefit in the LNG supply. And what's instead happened is that the Russians have used it against the Europeans. They've used it against the Ukrainians. And so far, Japan and the Russians are still cooperating, but it's impossible to know how long that will continue. I mean, even in 2018, the US president was famously mocked for warning the Germans in an EU meeting that dependence on Russian gas was going to lead to a very bad geopolitical situation for them. And despite all of his many, many failings and shortcomings, it turns out that this time President Trump was right. And the Russians did indeed abuse their energy dominance to bully Europe and then attack Ukraine. I mean, this shows us that Russia is not an energy partner that can be trusted, and Japan is learning from this experience. So just moving into the last 5-10 minutes now, guys. If you've got any questions, just let me know if I've rushed through something or if you want me to go over something. So anyway, the G7 communique of ministers from the Climate, Energy, Environment ministerial representatives, which was held in Sapporo, it's a very interesting document. I'd recommend you chase it down. It's 36 pages. The first half are interesting. The rest are copy paste as far as I can tell. But there's some really challenging policy points for Japan coming out of this G7 climate and energy communique. In section 70, the section on nuclear energy, the communique explicitly states, and I quote, "We recall the G7 leaders' commitment to evaluate measures to reduce reliance on civil nuclear-related goods from Russia and to assist countries seeking to diversify their supplies." So now we've painted the picture. Japan is going to cut its LNG by half by 2030, potentially destabilizing prices if it's not managed in a way that includes Russian suppliers being able to down-manage their production facilities. And the Europeans are planning to get rid of LNG from Russia entirely. At the same time, Japan's going to be switching back to its renuclearization program, and all G7 countries have explicitly stated that Russia and Russia alone needs to be excluded from the civil nuclear supply chain. So Japan is very much committed to taking part in this increasing isolation of Russia, which is a very dangerous game to play. I mean, I'm not saying it's not deserved, given Putin's behaviors recently, but it's perhaps not wise, all that being said. If Japan indeed lives up to its new G7 policy commitments, we can expect to see a drop in LNG demand over the next 7 years, triggering the price collapse. Simultaneously, shipping companies from around the world, which have fully committed to and invested $850 billion in the cryogenic fuel storage and piping and dual fuel systems required for LNG-based fleets, they're not going to reach their return on investment targets, which could lead to shipping companies all over the world just collapsing and going under, or ships being sold off for scrap. And there's the classification of carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas as well for regulatory purposes means that the LNG move itself, which was done ostensibly for sulfur emissions to be reduced, is kind of a dead end, as well as being very costly, because LNG being mostly methane is a hydrocarbon fuel. So even with the most efficient LNG system in the world, it was never going to be a fuel of the future, as it were. The Japanese commitment to reduce its energy mix from LNG by from 43.2% down to 27%, and taking nuclear back up to 22%, coupled with the renewed G7 commitment to deliberately exclude Russia from its nuclear supply chain, is bad news. That's the main point I want to get across to you guys. As a final note, it's interesting to consider that much of the messaging coming out of the Hiroshima G7 has been around condemning Russia and its, and here's a quote, attempts to use energy and food as tools of geopolitical coercion. Now, one thing that's come to mind, given my background as an army officer, is that you need to, in any situation, any competitive situation, consider things from the point of view of your opponent, and in this way, you gain deeper insight into their actions. And economics tells us that the stated intentions aren't all that important, and it's more about reading the revealed preferences of an actor, whether it's a state or a person, through their actions. So no matter what policy announcement we release, we need to look at the behaviors of the actors involved and deduce their goals and motivations. The G7 and Japan have condemned Russia's use of energy as a form of geopolitical coercion, and Japan has done very well so far to continue working with Russia on the LNG project in Sakhalin, and only to partially participate in Western sanctions against Russia. But from a Russian point of view, what are Western sanctions? What are Japanese sanctions except a form of geopolitical coercion through the withholding of energy and supplies? And Japan continues to work with the Russians, and I see this as a good thing. But now that they've come out of the G7 and they're committed overtly to excluding Russia from any ongoing, forward-going nuclear economy, at the same time as cutting LNG, the Russians are going to be in a very, very tight position. And there's an old saying about not backing people into a corner unless you really, really need to. So yeah, it'll be very hard for the Russians to see these policy commitments from Japan as anything other than attempts to use energy as a tool of geopolitical coercion, the very same thing that we've said they shouldn't do. So thank you very much, guys, for listening to my little presentation. Covered quite a lot of different topics. If there's any questions, please let me know. Anything I can clear up, or just any points of interest about Japanese fuel economics or maritime stuff, or anything about myself as well, that's fine. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Well, while listening to you, I was just nodding and thinking I that I couldn't agree more with you on everything you said, but especially the last part, how, if you are in any critical situation, you really need to consider that situation from the standpoint of your opponent, because otherwise there is no way of actually finding common ground and going into negotiations and finding a solution that can help both sides. Of course, we know that there are no solutions. Whenever there is a conflict, there are no solutions that can satisfy each side 100%. But at the same time, there should be something, that can stand there.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's an old saying in economics, which is there's no choices, there's only trade-offs. So
indeed,
trying to find which trade-off is acceptable to Japan and which trade-off is acceptable to Russia and then the Western Alliance or NATO or however you want to frame that, the Quad, is a real challenge. I mean, frankly, I find it deeply impressive diplomatically that the Japanese have managed to maintain working relations with the Russians in the Far East, in the Sakhalin Islands. I mean, it might take a little bit of split personality or whatever, but the fact that Japan can turn up to the G7 and commit to a lot of these very extreme, in my view, policy commitments in front of America and the UK and Germany and other Western powers, and at the same time still work with the Russians, it gives me a little hope. It gives me a little hope that maybe there might be some flexibility in this Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry's plan to achieve 22% nuclear, excluding Russia, by 2030 and cutting the LNG supply. I mean, if the relationship that Japan's building with the Five Eyes countries and especially Australia, if that's geopolitically, going to be the linchpin of the new Indo-Pacific rather than Asia-Pacific region going forward, then surely Japan can explain, we need to keep the Russians on side. We can't afford to have a war, with the Russians in the Far East. And if that means cutting LNG supply from Australia rather than cutting it from Russia, it might be worth doing, in my opinion.
David, I tend to think that the Japanese are very pragmatic, and as you have mentioned, they have managed to do that so far, to maintain the economic relations to a certain extent with Russia. And I would say that it's true also not only about LNG supplies, but also seafood supplies and also some other let's say, some other goods that they import from Russia, still import, even though there are sanctions and so on. They have agreed to impose those sanctions. And they're very pragmatic, very clever, very wise, even though my thoughts and your thoughts at the moment are probably considered heresy at this point.
Well, I made sure I did a lot of work this week. I got my old dissertation from my engineering college. I did a lot of work this week on making sure everything I said is justified, and I've got the sources and the government policy documents to prove it. So, I mean, if anybody's interested, I'm sure you can tell I was reading much of this speech. So I've got it written down, and I've got the sources and the links to the website. So if anybody wants a copy of that, I can send them out. It may be heresy to some people, but it's at least fact-based heresy.
Yeah. And also what you said about how actually the other side sees this situation is very important too. But like the Russians, they cannot see that there is real consideration of their position when it comes to LNG supplies and other supplies as well. So I'm afraid that it just the problem has been politicized so much in the past 2 or 3 years that it's very difficult to go back, especially.
Yes, it's hard to see how we can roll this back. I mean, Russia is in such a position that whilst I can recommend that, Japan and Russia had better fix this mismatch between supply and demand together in a sensible and slow, stage by stage manner. I have no idea how that could even possibly be done, given the fact that the so-called proxy war against Russia isn't so much proxy anymore. We've got troops on the ground from a number of NATO nations. We've got commitments from the UK and the US to bring over Ukrainian soldiers and pilots and train them on our simulators. I mean, the whole mask of this is a proxy war, really, they've really let it slip. This is barely a proxy war by any definition these days. So how we can get Russia back on side, short of, and I'm not suggesting this at all, but short of regime change, I don't see how we can get there. All I know is that Japan is about to trigger something very unpredictable. I mean, it could go okay. I mean, some other economic factor could occur, and the sudden reduction in price in LNG might cause something else to happen. And the problem isn't that LNG price collapse is definitely going to happen. The problem is that uncertainty is definitely going to happen, and global markets, investments respond to uncertainty, and that uncertainty is definitely coming. So that's the concern. If we can get rid of the uncertainty somehow, whether it's by bringing the Russians back into the fold internationally, which again, I can't see how we can do that given their behavior in Ukraine and war crimes and all sorts of stuff like that. But I mean, all I can offer is what the answer should be, what the solution should be, but I'm not really sure how to get there.
No, I'm not really sure how to get there, but we have seen Japan do it in the past. I think that you remember, maybe, was it 10, 12 years ago, with Iran and oil imports from Iran. So Japan managed to do it at that time. And I think that it has much more at stake at the moment in the case of LNG import from Russia than it had in the past with Iran. So I remain a moderate optimist here, even though you never know this coercion, as you said, the geopolitical coercion at the moment. And also, it's not only geopolitical, actually. There was, in the statements made by G7, there was that, economic coercion, was it what they called it?
Energy and food coercion. I think energy and tools as food. Energy and food as tools of geopolitical coercion. And I was surprised. I was reading this G7 report on climate, energy and environment, and I was preparing for this speech today, and as Mr. Janusz has correctly said in the comments, he thought the podcast today was about LNG, not about politics or Russia. Well, yeah, I mean, I also thought today, Janusz, that the talk today would be about the geopolitics of Japanese energy policy, mostly about the impact on the maritime sector. But honestly, go and read what's coming out of G7 at the moment. And in a 36-page document that's supposed to be about energy and the environment, you can't go 3 sentences without Russia and Russia's illegal war being mentioned. I'm not saying it's not an important factor, but it's not what you expect when you look at energy policy and environmental policy and climate change policy, that the entire thing seems to be Russia, Russia, Russia. So I'm sorry if we've strayed too much into Russian politics for you, Janusz. I can see your question here. What do you see the future of green hydrogen as a replacement for LNG. I'm really positive about the future of green hydrogen. I know some commentators think that moving over to ammonia-based fuels are not going to be possible, or fuels with zero emissions are not going to be possible. But I'll just mention two things as regard ammonia as a fuel. I mean, in terms of the high tech, the PhD guys who are designing the machines and the technology, I've not worked with that. But LNG was brought in to get rid of sulfur emissions mostly, and before that we were getting rid of NOx emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, by the use of either emulsification of the fuel or by catalytic converters. Now, I don't want to get too technical, but when you're emulsifying the fuel, you're basically deliberately adding water into the fuel in a special blended process, so that whenever the fuel is burned, it burns at a lower temperature, and as it burns at a lower temperature, you're going to produce less nitrous oxide pollutants. And unfortunately, that if you burn at a lower temperature, it means the combustion process is less efficient, which means you get more carbon monoxide pollutants. So they kind of move past this technology. We still have it on most of the ships I've worked on, but we don't use it very much because we found better solutions. But one thing that's quite interesting is the catalytic converter machinery that is used on ships as another method of removing nitrous oxides from the fuel. It uses an ammonia generator. So there's a lot of commentators and theoreticians who are worried, we can't have ammonia on ships. Ammonia is toxic. Ammonia is dangerous. Ammonia leaks would cause poisoning. It would kill the crew. And those are all real issues. But we already have ships that have catalytic converters on board. And the technical solution we have is, instead of storing the ammonia as ammonia, NH3, we store it as a urea solution. So you put this nitrogen hydrides, CONH22 plus H2O, you put it in solution at around 40%. So it's stored in a non-corrosive, non-toxic form. And then as the engine ramps up, the ammonia generator converts as needed, on a kind of just-in-time basis, converts the urea by removing the water and converting it into ammonia. Then the ammonia reacts with the exhaust gas coming out the engine and produces water and free nitrogen. And obviously, free nitrogen is not a pollutant; it's a normal, natural, perfectly healthy part of the environment. So there are plenty of ships out there already that have ammonia systems on board, and they've already solved the problem of how do we store, how do we train the crew to work with this dangerous toxic ammonia chemicals. We've already solved that problem. So the next problem then would be, okay, so if we're doing pure ammonia systems and we know how to store the ammonia in this urea form before it's processed in the engine, then we want to go to zero emissions. So when we're capturing the emissions from the chemical processes, we need a way to store that and then to offload it back to shore. But frankly, having seen the developments in LNG, I mean, basically in a 15-year period, the entire globe sprung up with LNG storage facilities in ports, running minus 162 degree LNG storage around the world, which is cryogenic temperatures. It's really kind of crazy and impressive when you think about it. So if we can do that, then setting up storage for ammonia-based reactors and their effluent to be taken on shore and then processed properly, I'm sure we'll be able to meet that challenge, no problem at all. So using ammonia as a method of generating green hydrogen, I think I'm very confident about that coming forward. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, David. And then there is a comment and a question from Stephen as well. So thank you for sharing your thoughts, insights, and opinions. If the aim is to achieve maritime decarbonization in addition to transition to green hydrogen, what are your thoughts on wind sustainable propulsion technology to reduce demand or achieve greater fuel efficiency?
Yeah, thank you, Maya, and thank you, Stephen, for the question. As an engineering officer, I am all about increasing fuel efficiency. It's one of the great challenges of the new environmental demands that are placed on shipping, is often these environmental demands are met at the cost of efficiency. Say on an LNG ship, on the previous example of emulsified fuels to reduce NOx emissions, because we're burning at lower temperatures deliberately to reduce this nitrous oxide pollutants. Not only are we doing incomplete combustion and less efficient combustion, and thereby producing more carbon monoxide pollutants, which can be acidifying and generally bad for the environment, we're running it less efficiently. So we need to use more fuel to produce the same amount of energy to be transferred to the ship's systems. So if we can if we can leverage any of these green technologies, I mean, obviously, I mentioned earlier in my talk, I live in a very nuclear industry part of Japan. The Mitsubishi plant, just a couple of kilometers from where I first lived back in 2007, they were one of the first plants to produce a working tokamak portable small size nuclear reactor. Now, I know some Russian icebreakers, as well as plenty of military ships, have nuclear reactors on board, and we're a long way from having nuclear power on civilian shipping. But it is a good sign to see nuclear energy was reclassified in the last couple of years, in the EU at least, as a green energy in itself. In terms of wind power, I'm an avid dinghy sailor, and I've been on yachts quite a few times, so I really enjoy sailing. A lot of the sailing cruise ships that you'll see, unfortunately, they have this tendency to run the engines to make sure the ship gets to the port for the destination for the tourists on time, and they adjust the sails not to make it more efficient or to make the ship run better. They adjust the sails so they have a lovely, beautiful curve in the sail. It looks so picturesque, and the guests on board can take photos of the lovely ship with the lovely curved sails. So those cruise ships tend to have sails on them for aesthetic purposes. But there's plenty of research going on about the use of sails on board, or kind of like solid state wings, like basically an aircraft wing, but aligned vertically out of the deck. And these can be used to reduce, to increase the efficiency of the ship by improving. It uses the lift from the wing to basically reduce the load on the engine. There's lots of research coming out about that at the moment. So I think it's looking very good in terms of the use of sustainable energy on ships.
That sounds. I wouldn't say interesting, because it's really very important to know those things. But also, Tim, I think that I interrupted you a little bit earlier.
No, I just want to say, David, I appreciate your measured, dispassionate, framing and analysis, and specifically, what kind of actions might be deserved, but it doesn't mean that those are the wise actions to take. And I think that's a really important, nuanced distinction that people have to at least think about, right? And, getting back to how Japan is very pragmatic, and, how they're doing their balancing act. I feel like with Japan, there's no zero-sum framing in these negotiations. Again, they're trying to be practical, and I think they're going into it with a realistic understanding of what's at stake, right? So I just wanted to, thank you, because I've learned a lot. I mean, my light bulbs have been going on. I wish I had more to contribute. This is not directly related, but it's interesting that last night on the Japanese news, there was a whole segment about using tempura oil to run airplanes. And, this is small potatoes. It's a tiny, tiny part of the energy market, but it was just kind of an interesting little piece I caught on the news last night. Anyway, that's all I got, but thank you so much, David.
No, thanks, Tim. It's been fun. I've enjoyed kind of gathering my thoughts and preparing for the presentation, and it's helped me. It's just the process of writing it down and getting it out there is going to help me clear up a few things in my own thinking. And certainly, returning to Stephen Cleary's point about green technologies, there's a lot of small ferries and small ships that were caught by the LNG market, and they put their ships in to be refitted for dual fuel purposes, and now they've got all this capital expenditure done, and it's not sure whether they're going to get the money back on that. But one thing that does look quite positive is battery technology. There's a lot of inshore vessels and small vessels that are looking to move over to battery power rather than hydrocarbons, and then hopefully further up the chain, these batteries will be charged obviously on shore facilities, and further up the chain we'll then have to deal with how we get the energy produced in the first place. And that could be civilian nuclear, that could be air, it could wind power, it could be tidal power, it could be all sorts of things. But certainly for deep sea vessels, shifting over to battery-based operations wouldn't be very safe, because depending on weather, it wouldn't really be possible to get ashore to charge your batteries, quite literally.
Right. So yeah, it's fascinating how There are a lot of alternatives, I believe, and especially in Japan, Japan can actually use quite a few different kinds of natural resources, but at the same time, we tend to say that Japan is poor in terms of energy resources here. And maybe this is because at the end of the day, the country has not really invested that much in developing those other resources. Like, of course, wind power is one of them, even though the situation there is changing. And then hydropower as well. There is, of course, there are quite a few power plants, water power plants here, but they're not the main source of energy. And many people were talking about geothermal energy as well. But at the end of the day, we need to think about what is available right now. And once again, we are going back. We have no choice but to go back to LNG and nuclear power.
So well, that's why I would say there that's why I tried to bring up the point that we're really shifting from the post-World War II mindset to this new great power competition era. I mean, it's not by accident that Japan has not developed its internal energy markets more. In fact, I believe it's quite deliberate. Most countries, from the member countries of the EU to South America, all these countries, one of the great bulwarks against conflict was, well, I produce wine and you produce potatoes, and I'll sell you the wine if you sell me the potatoes. And I produce LNG and you produce uranium or boron or some fancy chemical that we need. And Taiwan produces the microchips and Ukraine produces the wheat. And we had this whole system for 56 years post-World War II of deliberately globalizing, deliberately making sure that each country wasn't independent. And thereby we thought each country would be less likely to go to war with its neighbor. And now we've entered this very strange phase where that's not the case. Countries that are in mutually beneficial, deep relationships with, in something as vital as energy supply. I mean, that's what keeps the lights on in winter. It's what stops Granny from freezing and being able to cook a bowl of soup, and it's what keeps the trains running. And nowadays we're in a world where countries can't be relied upon to keep their side of the bargain. And Japan has these policy commitments from the G7 and also from its denuclearization thing. I'm not sure it's possible for Japan to keep going with its renuclearization strategy, because we live in a new reality now where mutual trade isn't going to guarantee safety, and Japan might need to consider its policies again in that situation.
Yes, I cannot agree more with you, but at the same time, once again, I'm a moderate optimist that, probably quite a few other countries, I mean, those countries that are out of G7, they see the world and they see the global economy from a different perspective. And even though they don't have the economic power at the moment to actually work in the opposite direction so that they can preserve the status quo of the countries being intertwined and their economies being connected so that peace is preserved, maybe in the near future that will change. So, of course, I'm just a desperate optimist, or I don't know how can I put it in a better way, but well, we'll see. There are definitely different forces, pulling in opposite directions here. So let's see.
Well, Maya, I know that you come from a particularly interesting perspective. I work on a lot of ships, and most of the engineering officers on the ships are Bulgarian, and they often tell me lots of interesting stories about having lived through the Soviet era and then being one of the nations that joined NATO as well, and the disappointments that things that the West told Bulgaria that were going to happen economically that didn't happen. And I understand that there's a lot of, not just from the Russians but from Eastern Europeans generally, there's a lot of suspicion of the good intentions of America, Japan, the UK, the Western Alliance, and often you need to observe the behaviours, not just the words coming out of policy meetings.
Yes, and also, well, that's true, but we also need to recognize the fact that different countries have different histories, right? They come from different historical countries. And if we don't recognize that, if we try to impose, just values from outside and so on, it's not going to work. It hasn't worked really well anywhere. But so I'm sorry, I don't want to go into this direction right now. I see that Yuka is on stage. So Yuka, thank you for joining us.
Hi, sorry, I'm always joining at the last minute. Call me a last minute person. Hi, David. Thank you so much. Actually, I was just thinking, it's kind of energy is not my, forte. So it's going to be very difficult. But, just 5-10 minutes ago, you just mentioned something that I thought, wow, I get excited when I learn something new, right? And then you said, so the energies, Japan intentionally didn't really develop certain, energy sources. That's intentional because just so that, that every part of the country on their own, they develop something they can offer to trade, just to maintain the peace. And then I thought maybe I wasn't well informed, but I haven't heard the person put that way. So I thought, thank you so much. I like it. Wow. I got so excited when I learned. Okay, I learned something new. Thank you.
No, my pleasure. I mean, it's I wasn't really sure. Maya asked me earlier in the week what I wanted to name this talk, and I wasn't really sure what to do because it is about Japanese energy policy, but also it's about the impact of that policy on global maritime supply chains. And those global maritime supply chains, we get 90% of all of our goods that you buy online or in the supermarket or in the store that comes from other countries. The reason it comes from other countries is we've had this deliberate policy, even since before the American era after World War II, even during the British Empire's days of ruling the high seas, we've had this policy of deliberately having a global spread out trade network. And the theory of peace through mutual trade, I think the era of that working has just ended, unfortunately. But yeah, I wasn't sure what to really, because I want to touch on some geopolitics, some economics, some tech stuff, some engine stuff. Just give you guys a bit of a whistle stop tour of the whole kind of energy sector and its current and impending collapse, so you guys can prepare for the future.
Well, are you saying that they're going to be the sequel to today's talk?
Well, Yuka, as I said in my introduction earlier, I've had 3 professions in my lifetime. I was a soldier in the British Army, an officer and leader in the British Army. And then I was an intercultural manager in a Japanese conglomerate for about 10 years. And I've been a maritime engineer working in fuel systems for the last 5 or 6 years. So I'd be happy to do a talk in the future. But given that we're in a Japan-themed group, maybe I'll do something on my experiences as an HR officer implementing programs at Tokyo or something. But I'm happy to talk about whatever as long as you guys are interested.
David, I'm happy to hear that, actually. I would love to have you once again with us. Not just once, of course, as long as
just once.
Come up. Yeah, I definitely hope to have you here with us again whenever it is convenient for you. And we have topics, of course, to talk about, topics related to Japan and in any field you have worked so far in. That's fascinating. It's definitely enlightening as well. So it's almost 9:00 and I'm going to close the room. So thank you very much indeed for being our guest speaker today. I wish that there were more people who would, let's say, consider the situation from different perspectives, not only from one. And hopefully this will change in the near future. Tim, if you have anything to say in conclusion, please go ahead and say that.
No, I just thank you very much, David. Very enlightening for me. I'd love to have you back on about basically anything you want to talk about. You're a very good speaker, so I appreciate the preparation and for you spending time with us today. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone in the room, for coming.
Thank you. And well, that's all for today. We'll be here once again on Sunday morning at age 20 with Japanese Politics One-on-One with Timothy Langley. And next week, Wednesday at 8:00 in the morning. So that's all for today. Have a great day and enjoy the week.